On paper, most people are doing exactly what they were told to do. They graduate from school, they enter the workforce, they build a stable career. Year after year, they show up, work hard, and slowly increase their income. And if you look at the surface of their financial life, everything appears normal. There's a steady paycheck, bills are being paid on time, rent or mortgage is covered. Maybe there's even a small retirement contribution happening in the background. From the outside, it looks like financial stability, but underneath that surface, something feels tight. Savings never seem to grow fast enough. Unexpected expenses still create stress. A single medical bill, car repair, or job disruption can still shake the entire financial system. And perhaps the most frustrating part is this: many of these people are not irresponsible with money. They're not constantly overspending. They're not making reckless financial decisions. In fact, many of them are doing what traditional financial advice tells them to do. They budget. They try to save. They avoid obvious mistakes. And yet years go by and real wealth never seems to appear. The investment accounts grow slowly, emergency savings feel fragile, and the idea of true financial freedom still feels far away. This creates a quiet question that many people carry privately. If someone is working hard, earning a decent income, and trying to manage their finances responsibly, why does building wealth still feel so difficult? Why do so many middle-class households spend decades working, yet still feel financially fragile? The common explanation is usually personal behavior. People assume the problem must be discipline. Maybe people aren't saving enough. Maybe they spend too much. Maybe they just need better financial habits. But when you step back and examine the situation more carefully, a different pattern begins to emerge. Because the real problem often isn't behavior. The real problem is financial structure. Most people build their lives inside a system where nearly every dollar of income is already committed before it even arrives. Housing costs rise, transportation costs rise, insurance costs rise, debt payments slowly accumulate, and over time, fixed expenses begin to absorb almost the entire paycheck. When that happens, wealth accumulation becomes extremely difficult, even for people who are responsible with money. Because wealth is not created by income alone. Wealth is created by financial margin. Margin is the gap between what you earn and what your life costs to maintain. And for many households, that margin slowly disappears. The result is a financial life that looks stable on the outside, but is actually very fragile underneath. In this video, we're going to break down why most people never build wealth, even when they work hard and earn reasonable salaries. We'll look at the financial structure behind the problem, the psychological pressure it creates, and why small disruptions can quickly turn into serious financial stress. And most importantly, we'll explore the structural shift that separates households that slowly build wealth from those that remain stuck in financial maintenance mode. Because once you understand how the system works, you start to see why this pattern repeats across millions of households. So stay with me until the end of this video, because the final section explains the structural change that quietly separates financially stable households from financially fragile ones. And if you enjoy calm, analytical breakdowns of how money systems actually work, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Kane Invests. Because on this channel, we focus on understanding the hidden mechanics behind personal finance. Not hype, not shortcuts, but the systems that shape financial outcomes over time. To understand how this plays out in real life, consider someone like Daniel. Daniel is 36 years old and lives in Columbus, Ohio. He works as an operations supervisor at a regional logistics company and earns about $78,000 per year. By most middle-class standards, this is considered a solid income. After federal taxes, state taxes, health insurance deductions, and retirement contributions through his employer, Daniel's take-home pay is roughly $4,700 per month. From the outside, Daniel's financial life looks stable. He has a steady job, he pays his bills on time, and he has never missed a major payment. But when we break down his monthly financial structure, something interesting appears. His rent for a two-bedroom apartment is $1,850 per month. His car payment is $510. Car insurance costs another $190. Student loan payments add $420 per month. Groceries and basic household expenses average around $600. Utilities and internet together come to about $230. Health-related expenses that aren't fully covered by insurance add roughly $150 each month. Gas and transportation costs average around $220. Phone bill and digital subscriptions total about $120. When you add all of these together, Daniel's regular monthly expenses come to roughly $4,290. That leaves him with about $410 of financial margin each month. On paper, this might seem manageable. After all, Daniel isn't running a deficit, but here's the reality of everyday life. Normal disruptions happen constantly. A car repair might cost $900. Travel to visit family might cost $600. A medical bill could could arrive unexpectedly. A friend's wedding might require flights, hotels, and gifts. Over the course of an entire year, those irregular expenses slowly absorb most of that remaining margin. So by the end of the year, Daniel hasn't done anything reckless with money, he hasn't made irresponsible purchases, but his financial position still looks roughly the same. His retirement account grows slowly through automatic contributions. His savings account moves up a little, then back down when life happens. And wealth, real meaningful financial freedom, still feels distant. The key point here is important. Daniel's situation is not unusual. In fact, it closely resembles the financial structure of millions of middle-class households across the United States. They are earning income, they are paying their obligations, but their financial system leaves very little room for meaningful wealth accumulation. And when financial margin stays small for long periods of time, something else begins to change. Not just the numbers, but the way people think and make decisions about money. And that psychological shift plays a much bigger role in wealth building than most people realize. When financial margins are small, the impact is not just mathematical, it becomes psychological. Because money is not only a financial resource, it is also a cognitive resource. When money feels tight, the brain begins operating under constant pressure. Researchers in behavioral economics often describe this as the scarcity mindset. Scarcity doesn't just mean having less money, it means having very little room for error. When every paycheck is already allocated to fixed expenses, even small financial decisions begin to carry weight. And that changes how people think. In Daniel's case, his financial structure leaves him with around $400 of margin each month. That margin may look reasonable on paper, but psychologically it feels extremely narrow. Because Daniel knows that one unexpected event can erase it instantly. If the car needs a repair, the margin disappears. If medical costs show up unexpectedly, the margin disappears. If rent increases next year, the margin disappears. Over time, this creates a background level of financial tension. Daniel may not talk about it openly, but he feels it in subtle ways. He hesitates before making purchases. He constantly checks his bank account before spending. He postpones certain decisions because they feel financially risky. This isn't irresponsible behavior. It's the natural result of operating inside a system with very little financial buffer. And over time, this pressure affects decision-making in important ways. One of the most interesting findings in behavioral economics is that scarcity actually reduces cognitive bandwidth. When people are constantly thinking about money constraints, their mental energy becomes focused on immediate financial problems. Questions like, can I afford this right now? Will my account cover this expense? Should I delay this payment? These small calculations happen repeatedly throughout the month. Individually, they seem minor, but together they consume a surprising amount of mental attention. And when the brain is focused on short-term financial management, it becomes harder to think about long-term wealth building. Investing decisions get postponed. Career risks feel more dangerous. Opportunities that require temporary income instability become difficult to consider. In other words, tight financial margins do something subtle but powerful. They force people into a maintenance mindset. Instead of thinking about expansion, growth, or long-term strategy, most energy is spent simply maintaining financial stability. And this psychological shift plays a much larger role in wealth outcomes than many people realize. Because wealth building often requires long-term thinking, patience, and strategic risk-taking, but when financial systems are fragile, those types of decisions feel uncomfortable or even irresponsible. So people remain cautious. They maintain stability. They avoid risk, which is perfectly rational behavior given their financial structure. But this cautious environment creates another hidden cost, one that most people only notice years later. Because when financial margin stays tight, it doesn't just affect how people think, it also affects what they are able to do with their lives. And that leads to one of the most important and often invisible barriers to building wealth: the cost of missed opportunity. This main people of time, this difference becomes extremely powerful. Two households might earn similar incomes for decades, but the household with more liquidity and margin can pursue opportunities that the other cannot. They can take calculated risks. They can remain patient during uncertainty. They can allocate capital when opportunities appear. The other household remains focused on maintaining stability. And this is why wealth is not just about income. Wealth is about flexibility. Liquidity creates optionality. Optionality creates opportunity. But when financial systems are tight, opportunity slowly disappears. And this brings us to another structural issue that makes wealth building difficult for many households. Because when margins are small, the financial system becomes extremely sensitive to disruption. Small problems don't stay small. They begin to cascade. And that's where financial fragility begins to reveal itself. When financial financial margins are small, the system may appear stable most of the time, but stability can be misleading because systems with very little margin are often extremely fragile. They function normally right up until something slightly unexpected happens. And in modern financial life, small disruptions happen constantly. A car repair, a medical expense, a temporary reduction in work hours, an insurance deductible, a rent increase at the end of a lease. Individually, none of these events are catastrophic, but inside a financial system with very little liquidity, even minor disruptions can create cascading problems. Let's go back to Daniel for a moment. One morning, his car begins making a loud grinding noise during his commute. He takes it to a mechanic. The diagnosis is a worn-out transmission component. The repair cost is $1,350. For someone with significant savings, this is inconvenient but manageable. But Daniel currently has about $1,800 in his savings account. Paying the repair would eliminate most of his emergency buffer, which creates another problem. Without an emergency fund, the next unexpected expense becomes dangerous. So instead of paying the full repair from savings, Daniel decides to place $900 of the repair cost on a credit card and cover the rest with cash. This seems like a reasonable short-term solution, but this is where a common financial pattern begins. Economists sometimes describe this process as debt layering. One small disruption leads to a new debt obligation. Now Daniel has a new monthly payment. Maybe it's $70 or $90 per month, depending on the repayment plan. At first, this seems minor, but the problem is that the financial system was already operating with limited margin. That extra payment reduces his monthly flexibility even further. And this is where something called volatility clustering begins to appear. In finance, volatility clustering means that disruptions often arrive close together rather than evenly spaced. For example, imagine this sequence over a few months. First, the car repair, then a $500 medical bill that insurance doesn't fully cover, then an annual insurance premium increase. None of these events are extreme, but when they arrive close together, they begin to compress financial margins even more. And as margins compress, households often rely on short-term financial tools to maintain stability. Credit cards, personal loans, buy now, pay later services. These tools are not inherently bad, but when they become part of the normal financial structure, something important changes. Fixed expenses begin to grow. Each new payment reduces financial flexibility. Over time, the household's financial system becomes more rigid. More of the paycheck is pre-committed to obligations. And when that happens, the system becomes even more fragile because the next disruption has fewer resources available to absorb it. This creates what many households quietly experience but rarely describe directly. A feeling that they are constantly managing financial pressure rather than building financial strength. They are maintaining stability, but they are not moving forward. And over long periods of time, this fragile structure prevents the slow accumulation of wealth. Because wealth building requires something very specific. Not just income, not just discipline, but financial stability with margin. Which brings us to the final part of the discussion. Because the solution to this problem is not about extreme budgeting or complicated investment strategies. The real solution is a structural change in how financial systems are built. A shift away from financial fragility toward financial resilience. If the core problem is financial structure, then the solution cannot simply be better discipline or more detailed budgeting. The solution has to be structural, because wealth is rarely built through small optimizations alone. It is built through financial systems that create margin, stability, and optionality over long periods of time. And the most important principle behind those systems is surprisingly simple. Stability first, optimization later. Most financial advice focuses on optimization, how to invest better, how to pick the right portfolio, how to maximize returns. But investment performance matters far less if the underlying financial structure is fragile. If a household has very little margin, even a well-designed investment plan can collapse and unexpected expense appears, which is why the first step toward building wealth is not maximizing returns. It is creating financial margin. Margin is the gap between what a household earns and what it costs to maintain their lifestyle. When this gap is small, wealth accumulation becomes extremely slow. But when this gap begins to widen, something powerful happens. Cash flow begins to accumulate. Savings begin to grow, and the household gradually develops liquidity. Liquidity is one of the most underestimated forms of financial strength because liquidity provides something that income alone cannot provide: time and flexibility. With sufficient liquidity, households can absorb disruptions without taking on new debt. A car repair becomes a manageable inconvenience rather than a financial setback. A medical bill becomes a temporary expense instead of a credit card balance. And when disruptions stop turning into debt, something else begins to happen. The financial system becomes stable. Once stability exists, households can begin making longer-term decisions. They can invest consistently. They can remain invested during market downturns. They can consider career changes or geographic moves that may increase income over time. In other words, liquidity restores optionality, and optionality is one of the quiet foundations of wealth building. Another structural shift involves reducing fixed expenses. Fixed expenses are dangerous because they cannot easily adjust when income changes. Rent, car payments, loan obligations, and insurance premiums all operate as fixed financial commitments. The more of these commitments a household carries, the more rigid their financial system becomes. Wealth building becomes easier when a greater percentage of income remains flexible. This doesn't require extreme lifestyle changes, but it often requires intentional financial architecture, choosing housing costs that leave breathing room, avoiding unnecessary long-term debt obligations, allowing income growth to expand financial margin instead of expanding lifestyle costs at the same pace. Over time, these structural decisions begin to compound. A household that consistently maintains margin builds liquidity. Liquidity creates resilience. Resilience allows long-term investing, and long-term investing slowly builds wealth, not through dramatic financial moves, but through stable systems that work quietly in the background for decades, which is why the question of wealth is rarely about intelligence or effort. Most people work hard. Most people try to manage their finances responsibly. The real difference often lies in the structure of the system they are operating inside. When the system leaves no margin, progress becomes difficult. When the system creates stability and liquidity, wealth building becomes possible. And once you begin looking at personal finance through this structural lens, many financial patterns suddenly start to make much more sense. If you found this breakdown helpful and you enjoy calm, analytical explanations of how financial systems actually work, consider liking the video and subscribe to Kane Invests, where we explore the mechanics behind money, wealth, and financial decision making. Because understanding the structure behind personal finance is often the first step toward changing it.